Hi, welcome to the Getty and to today's Art Break, an armchair traveler's guide to the medieval world. We're so excited to have you here today, and I think we have a really exciting program, so we're happy you're taking a break wherever you are to listen to us. I wanted to begin by thanking all of my colleagues here at the Getty who made this program possible and are working even right now behind the scenes to make sure that everything flows smoothly. This art break is in association with a current exhibition at the Getty Center, The Book of Marvels, Wonder and Fear in the Middle Ages, which will be up until August 25th, 2024. So I hope you'll be able to join us in person to see that exhibition as well. The exhibition is in celebration of this manuscript that you see on the scene, that on the screen, that we acquired about 2 years ago, called The Book of the Marvels of the World. And it's a manuscript made around 1460 in France. And it describes all the things that people in France thought were happening in different areas of the world, including Europe, Africa, and Asia. And we're going to be getting into it a little bit during the course of today's discussion. I wanted to mention that there is a kind of twin manuscript to our manuscript made exactly in the same time and place. That's at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. And so we are very fortunate to have this manuscript currently on loan in our exhibition. And then the Getty manuscript will actually travel to the Morgan, and they will do their own version of the exhibition. And that opens on January 24th, 2025. So if you can't join us here in California, hopefully you can go see the manuscripts when they're on display in New York. There is a publication that unites both exhibitions. It is co-authored by myself and my co-curator on the Getty Marvels exhibition, Dr. Kellen Michael, who is a former graduate intern in the department. The two other authors are Associate Curator of Manuscripts here at the Getty, Dr. Larissa Grollemond, and Associate Curator of Manuscripts at the Morgan Library in New York, Dr. Joshua Driscoll. And I just wanted to say thanks to all of my co-authors for all of the ideas that you'll be hearing, some of which you'll be hearing today. And now I would like to welcome my co-conspirator for the day, Dr. Mark Cruz. Hi, Mark.
Hey.
So glad to have you here today. Mark is Associate Professor of French at Arizona State University. His research focuses on contact between France and foreign cultures in the Middle Ages and early modernity. His book, The Mongol Archive in Late Medieval France, Text, Objects, and Counters, 1221 to 1422, will be published next year by Cornell University Press. Congrats on that, Mark. And he is currently writing a book on the medieval origins of French colonialism. Mark and I have been friends and colleagues for a very long time, spending much time together at various conferences. And I thought he would be a perfect counterpoint to me today to talk about trade and counters and all the various things about how medieval Europeans saw the world. So welcome.
Thanks very much. Great to see you. Great to be with you. And also thanks to all of those who are listening to us right now and participating in this great art break.
We're so excited to talk today about various aspects. We thought we would begin by giving a little bit of an orientation about how medieval peoples understood the world in a European perspective. And then we'll be moving on to three names that might be familiar to you of great sort of travelers, conquerors, traders of the Middle Ages, just to give you sort of a peek about how people were conceptualizing the greater world. And we're starting with these two images. Mark, can you talk us through them?
Sure. So we thought that the image on the left was interesting because it is foundational to the European medieval understanding of the world. So what people are looking at is what's known as an OT map. So the O is the shape of the circle, the T is the water in the center. And this is the basic scholastic map in medieval Europe. It is used throughout schools, monasteries, cathedral schools for centuries in medieval Europe. And what it shows is the top half is Asia, at the very top of which is Paradise, the Garden of Eden, from which flow four rivers, the four rivers of Paradise. And then the bottom left quadrant is Europe, and the bottom right quadrant is Africa. And dividing Europe and Africa is water, which represents the Mediterranean. So as you see, the East is oriented to the north, and the reason for this is that the East was the privileged site in medieval Europe. It's where Eden was represented, and it was also understood to be full of might and wealth. So this is a basic image of the world. On the right, we chose this image because, as people can see, it's a very different conception of the world. The world's contours are closer to accurate, although, of course, far from what we know to be true. But nonetheless, this map on one level shows an evolution of growth in European understanding of the space of Europe, Africa, and Asia. And so one reason that I think these two maps are important and great to show together is that they show the evolution of knowledge about geography in the medieval West. People may have come to this discussion with the understanding that in the Middle Ages, they thought the world was flat or they didn't know a lot about the world beyond Europe. And as we were going to discuss today, that is not entirely true. There was indeed a great deal of myth and wonder in their understanding, but what I like to emphasize in my own work is this development, this growth of knowledge.
And I think, Mark, it's really interesting. I think it's maybe hard for a lot of viewers out there to envision a world where we don't have Wikipedia, we don't have jet planes, we don't have photographs of foreign places. Everything that medieval Europeans knew or thought they knew about these places far away from Europe were based on these manuscripts, right? And maps like this. And so I think one of the things we're going to be talking about today is that not only was there a lack of access to knowledge about the greater world, but there was also fear about the greater world. And I think you can see that in this map that Mark was discussing here. This is a map from 1493, so it doesn't incorporate places like Australia or the Americas. All you can see are Africa, Asia, and then Europe up here. But also you can see this sort of like strip of strange peoples, legendary peoples with 6 arms or horse legs or multiple eyes. And this was their representation of what they thought was happening at the edges of the world, the places they didn't know so well. And so these peoples have been literally and figuratively marginalized, which I think is really interesting. And I think that kind of lack of knowledge of the world is played up in more modern history with this idea that people in the Middle Ages did not know that the world was round. And so we have this slide to prove to all of you out there that people in the Middle Ages did indeed understand that the world was round. And Mark, according to what I know, the idea that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat and you would go sailing off the edge. That's sort of a 19th century misconception or actually disinformation, isn't it?
Yes, that's my understanding as well. If it arose in the 19th century specifically, I'm not sure actually. But it's part of the othering of the Middle Ages and the rendering marginal of the Middle Ages, especially within the university curriculum. And so we chose these images because it's a reminder to people that already the ancient Greeks understood that the world was a sphere. And there are various ways that they came to that knowledge, mainly through astronomical observation. And so what we are showing you here are 3 different examples of medieval artists visualizing this understanding. Now, what the medievals didn't understand, of course, was how big Eurasia and Africa were. They didn't know the distance between the western end of Eurasia and the eastern end of Eurasia. Aristotle said that there was a narrow sea between the two. Of course, the discoveries of the Americas will explode that whole idea. But nonetheless, these images are wonderful because they establish that, once again, if you came to this art talk with certain understandings about medieval simplicity, naivete about the wider world, yes, certainly that is the case. But nonetheless, the medievals understood that the world was, for example, circumnavigable, that if you left home and went in one direction, eventually you would come back home. And these are artists who are trying to convey this idea in a very direct, small, but cogent space. And that's another reason I think that we like these images, is that they speak very profoundly to this understanding of a spherical world.
And I think what's interesting is they even clearly, according to the image on the right, they had an understanding that when one side of the earth was facing the sun, the other side would be dark. So that's, I think, a much more sophisticated understanding than what most people think people in the Middle Ages had. And so I love this image here where you can actually see buildings and whatnot going all the way around, which really emphasizes that idea of the understanding of the sphere. And today, for the rest of the time, we're going to be talking about 3 people who actually contributed quite a bit to an understanding, a European understanding of the wider world. And those three people are these that you see on the screen: Alexander the Great, Marco Polo, and Christopher Columbus. And so we thought we would look at sort of images that were created that envisioned the kind of voyages and journeys of these three individuals through time in the Middle Ages. And I think we're going to be finding some really exciting things. So let's start with Alexander the Great, who is a great buddy of Mark's, who has been by his side through most of your scholarly career, right?
Indeed. Yep.
And it's really, Mark's specialty is really the medieval interpretation of Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great, as you can see from the dates on the screen, was someone who was part of the ancient world, but he was really much admired in the medieval world. And so I'm just going to show you two conceptions of Alexander the Great from the medieval perspective. And maybe, Mark, you can talk a little bit about why people were so entranced by Alexander the Great and what they thought he actually did.
Sure. So the first thing to appreciate, everybody, is that the Alexander romance, as it is known, which is the legendary life of Alexander, is one of the first great examples of world literature. So by the time of the Middle Ages, there are Alexander legends, versions of it, from Indonesia to Ireland. So everybody in Eurasia, and indeed many in Africa, know about the life of Alexander. And his example is so compelling because he is a man who takes a small group of people and manages to conquer some of the greatest empires of his time. So he is seen as the embodiment of royal wisdom, of courage, of warrior strategy. He is also a negative example in many ways, but we'll talk more, I think, about the positives today. And so we chose these two images because these images capture one very important exemplary aspect of Alexander's life, and that is the fact that he conquered space, both vertically and horizontally. So not only was he a conqueror on land, but as you see in these two images on the left, this is Alexander's underwater descent. He has a glass barrel made, and he is dropped into the water, and there he observes the fishes, and in various versions of the story, he comes back with various moral insights, one of which is that the big fish eat the little fish, and this justifies further conquest. And on the right, we have another form of vertical conquest in which Alexander places himself in a cage or a chariot. The conveyance depends on the version, but he attaches it to griffins. Projecting from the top of this cage here, you see meat, which the griffins fly up to catch. Of course, they can't get to it because they're chained, and this causes the conveyance to rise into the air. So this is Alexander's vertical conquest, as it were, to go along with the horizontal conquest of land. And it shows that Alexander is a universal conqueror. So that's one of the reasons that we chose these.
And just to clarify to people, these are both made-up stories. As Mark mentioned, this is the romance of Alexander, not a historical biography. And a lot of what kind of crept into the romance of Alexander was based on a series of letters that he wrote to his tutor, Aristotle, whom many of you may have heard of. And he had all these sort of fabulous adventures that were in these sort of like, they were fake letters, essentially, talking about how he went to India or he went to all these various places and saw or experienced these things himself. And so again, we know Alexander the Great was, of course, an amazing conqueror, but they're sort of making him into this amazing adventure guy as well, with his sort of like descent into the sea and his ascent into the heavens. And we're going to see that over and over when we look at these images of Alexander the Great. So why don't you tell us about this one?
Sure. So what's interesting about Alexander is that in many ways he embodies a paradox or a contradiction at the heart of the medieval European attitude towards the world. On the one hand, people are curious about the world. They want to know more about it. They want to conquer. They want to convert. They want to explore. They want to exploit. But on the other hand, there's a fear of that world, as Beth mentioned just a minute ago. And so here we see an illustration of the scene in which Alexander walls off the peoples who are known as Gog and Magog, whom you see in the top of the image up there. Gog and Magog are described in the Alexander tradition as a monstrous people who will, in some versions, become allied with Antichrist at the end of time. And the legend says that Alexander walls them off behind what's known as the Caspian Gates or the Caucasus Mountains. You see that there's a wall being constructed there in the image in the bottom left. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that Alexander is kneeling in the foreground of the image and that God is up in the corner. And he is saying to Alexander, good job. This is what you need to be doing. You need to be walling off these apocalyptic peoples. So we chose this image because just as Alexander travels and is an adventurer and an explorer, he's also someone who establishes boundaries between Europe and the rest of the world. And so there's this tension within the Alexander legend between going forth into the world and conquering it and becoming part of it and walling it off.
And Mark, just to, I'm going to point out to people, you're talking about these sort of peoples being monstrous. You can see these are actually tusks that are sort of coming out of their mouths, right? To make them more like animals than like people. And that's something we're going to see again and again during the course of this talk, the idea of dehumanizing peoples to make them more animal-like versus human. Another thing I just wanted to point out about what Mark was saying that's fascinating is you see God up here, and there's a sort of like time slippage, right? Because there's this implication somehow that Alexander was approved of by the Christian God. But of course, this is before the time of Christianity. So it's like rewriting history a little bit, isn't it?
It's exactly right. It's a great example of how when they write the Alexander legend in medieval Europe, they cast him as a pre-crusader, a proto-crusader, someone who was on the side of the Judeo-Christian God. In some cases, unbeknownst to him, he's carrying out the will of God. But the larger point is that Alexander is made to fit into the Christian plan of salvation.
And so I think, when we look at images like this, these are 4 different images taken from a singular manuscript of the Romance of Alexander. What I think is fascinating about the way the artist is constructing these scenes is that Alexander and his people are on horses in full armor in all of them, and they're always encountering something foreign. And the idea is this repetition of the idea of conquering and encountering these kinds of peoples. And so in the upper left here, you have these peoples called Blemmyes, who just have no head, but they have a singular eye in the sort of center of their chest. Then over here, we have wild boars and elephants. And of course, we do know that he did actually see elephants when he was in India. So that one is sort of like a more true kind of thing. But then down here, we see these crowned dragons who have eyes all over them, which is really interesting. And I think if you look at these, you can see they've got their weapons out, they're fighting, they're ready to sort of conquer them. And then you look at this one and you see the figures are a little bit different. He's not as much in armor, and he's encountering these 2 beautiful women in a forest. And I just want to read you a little bit of a version from the Book of Marvels, the manuscript we started with, about this encounter, because I think it's really fun. He says that, and this is Alexander, he says that in India, he found along the banks of the river Odinani, huge women, all naked, who were in the river and had hair hanging down to the ground. And they fought exceedingly hard against men who happened on them. And when they captured a man, they took any pleasure in him. They carried him to an out-of-the-way place among the hot reeds and rushes. And there they forced him to have carnal knowledge with them. For they are so hot, disorderly, and abominable in vile lust that it is a wonder. And this race of women Alexander took just 2 who were very beautiful and fair. And so here you see the 2 women. And it's a really interesting kind of revelation about the way that medieval people saw women as these sort of vile corruptors who would force men to have sex with them. But I think it's interesting in the sort of way these 4 images are shown is that they're quite fighting and quite belligerent in all of these images. And then you get down here and they're like, oh, beautiful women. Hello.
And this also echoes another aspect of the Alexander legend, which is the fear of being seduced by the other, the fear of losing one's real self, true self, as it were, and becoming something that one was not originally. Indeed, this is one of the themes in the Alexander story, is that Alexander himself goes native, as it were. He goes both Egyptian when he conquers Egypt, has himself declared a god in Egypt, and then when he gets to Persia, he declares himself the emperor of Persia, marries into the Persian royal family, and then when he gets to India, same thing, marries Roxanne. So Alexander, again, represents this tension that the Europeans feel between venturing into the world and staying home and protecting one's true identity. Otherwise, I just want to point out about the armor that this armor is late medieval European plate armor. So if people are struck by this, medieval artists are not concerned with anachronism. They're not concerned with archaeological reconstructions of Alexander. Alexander is portrayed as a medieval knight. We call this medievalization. Alexander is medievalized. He is put into the idiom of medieval stories and culture. And this is not at all atypical. Alexander is made to look like a medieval knight and king.
And I noticed in the chat, someone was talking about how women with red hair played into this narrative. And as a redhead myself, I would like to note that it still happens. They always say redheads are fiery. So these kind of stereotypes that we think of are not just medieval. These are things that last into the contemporary culture. And I think that's really important about something that Mark has mentioned a couple of times now, is this idea of othering people. And many people on with us today may not have really heard of the word other used as a verb, but it's something that is very common in sort of when we talk about travel and being foreign and all of this. The idea of othering is to see the world primarily into two sort of groups. The group that you yourself feel like you represent, and then everyone else who is the other. And the process of othering someone or othering a culture is to emphasize that idea of foreignness, a little bit of scary, a little bit of wonder, all of those kinds of things. And I think that's a really important concept.
Excellent point. Yep.
Here, we just wanted to end our section on Alexander the Great with this image of India, which is from the Book of Marvels of the World, the manuscript that with its Morgan counterpoint is sort of the heart of the exhibition that's currently up at the Getty. And again, you see those two women that I was reading that quote about. Here are the two women that Alexander Great took away. And again, we have this sort of combination of myth and legend. So for instance, we have elephants, but we also have unicorns and dragons. And for instance, over here in this corner, the text talks about how people in India refuse to eat meat, which we actually do know is true. But here the artist historic have taken it one step further in othering these people by adding the fact that they're covered in fur and they sort of like grab fish right out of the water and eat them whole. And so I call these the dreaded pescatarians that inhabit the land of India. But there's all sorts of wonderful things. And when you come to the Getty's exhibition, you can hear all about the apple smellers and the two-headed ducks and the dog-headed men, which we'll be discussing a little bit as well. So that is leading us to an actual real traveler whom most of you have probably heard of, Marco Polo, the Venetian who was very famous for his account of his travels to India and China. Is there anything you want to say to kind of introduce this Mark by Mark?
Yes, indeed. Mark, speaking about Marco. So what I'd like people to appreciate about Marco Polo is that he is the first European that we are aware of who lives for an extended period of time in Asia, returns to Europe, and writes an account of his time abroad. And he writes in a dialect of Old French because he wants a large lay audience. And his text survives to the present in 141 manuscripts or fragments. It was read across Europe. And you may have heard, or you may have the impression that people didn't trust Polo, that they didn't believe him. That is probably true to a certain extent, but the people who made up the elite in Europe, and I mean kings and popes and Franciscans and Dominicans, the educated, they for the most part did believe Polo because they had had contact themselves or knew people had contact with people like the Mongols or the Chinese or people in Central Asia, or they themselves had traveled as far as, say, India or Central Asia. So what Polo does is he expands geographical knowledge in Western Europe vastly by describing a whole part of the world that was never described in the Bible or in ancient Greek or Roman texts. And in fact, I wrote an article at one point about how many toponyms, that is to say place names, Polo mentions that had never appeared in any European text before, and I estimate that there are as many as 200. So Polo vastly expanded our understanding of geography, and we're about to see an example of how that works in practice.
So this is a very famous map that's at the National Library in France. It's called the Catalan Atlas. And as you can see, it's a very large and detailed map. And the part that we're going to, and you can see here, just to sort of orient you, you can see Italy here, you can see Spain, you can see England up here. This is the northern coast of Africa. And then, of course, we go through the Mediterranean over to Asia. And the part that we're actually going to concentrate on for the moment is this little area up here. And you can see the map is so big that you can see it from two sides. And so everything on the top is sort of upside down. So we're just going to spin it around for you so you can see it a little bit better. And this is what Mark was referring to in terms of seeing Marco Polo like in his journey.
So the Catalan Atlas was made for the King of France, Charles V, who reigned 1364 to 1380. The map, we can't show you a lot of detail, ladies and gentlemen, because the map is 10 feet long by 2.5 feet high. It's a table map. And as far as we know, it is the oldest map extant that uses Marco Polo's geography. And that's why Asia is so much bigger on this map than on any previous European map. And we wanted to focus on this particular detail because it shows merchants who were traveling from west to east. And that is what the text, the rubric above it says. In fact, it says that this caravan has left from the land of Sara, which is in Central Asia, and is going to the land of Cathay, which is China, the northern part of the Mongol Empire in China. So what we like about this is that, first of all, we see camels, and these are Bactrian camels. They're two-hump camels with packs slung between their two humps. We see the attendants in the center of the composition who are on foot. And then we have the merchants themselves who have the wealth and the privilege to ride on horses. And one of the most famous details here is on the right, the figure in green who is falling asleep on his horse. And this is to remind us of the fact that travel and travail have the same etymological root in Latin, tripare, and that word originally meant to torture or to cause torment to. Travel is not easy in the Middle Ages, and this image is on the Catalan Atlas in many ways as a testament to the bravery and the wherewithal and the chutzpah of these merchants who made these journeys over great distances, over very hostile terrain, in order to secure wealth for themselves and various intermediaries and lords.
And I think one of the things that's important for people to keep in mind, because I think most people have heard of Marco Polo, but and they think of him as a great traveler and a great adventurer, but he was in it for the money. His family were traders. This is exactly what they were hoping, that they were getting out of these travels. And I think a lot of people forget about that. And when he came back, he was so wealthy because he had all these gems that he brought from the Far East. But the idea was to enhance his family's business, essentially.
Absolutely right. And what's also another reason that we chose this image is because going to China, Marco Polo with his father and uncle took the land route. They went exactly in this style. They went back to Venice by the sea route, but this gives us a really wonderful indication of what it was like to travel these great distances back then. And indeed, it was for the money.
Yeah. And I see that we have a question about what the material is the Catalan Atlas is drawn on. I believe it's parchment, animal skin parchment. Is that correct, Mark?
That is correct.
So you can imagine how many animals had to die to make a map that was 10 feet long and 2.5 feet high. But it was individual skins that were kind of put together and probably glued together at the edges.
Correct.
Okay, so now we move on to what is perhaps the most famous manuscript of Marco Polo's account, which was much later than Marco Polo's time period, and was made in Paris in the early part of the 15th century. And you can see here, this is one of the first images in the manuscript, right, Mark?
Actually, it comes toward the middle of the manuscript,
it does.
and it comes after Marco Polo's text. It's a text written probably by a Franciscan, describing the Mongol Empire in China. It's called On the Estate of the Great Khan. And we chose this because Polo, unlike Alexander, was not afraid of the foreign and of the other. Marco Polo writes that Kublai Khan, so the great Mongol Khan, who was the ruler of China, was the greatest man born since Adam, so the greatest person ever. And Polo goes on to say that if you combined all of the potentates of Europe, of Latin Christendom, combined, they would not be as great as Kublai is. So we wanted people to get a sense of this respect, indeed this love, this admiration that one could feel as a European for the foreign other. And what I like about this image is that the artist has not chosen any kind of demonizing imagery to depict the court of the Khan. Yes, the headgear is exotic, it's orientalizing, but otherwise we see the generous use of gold leaf in order to convey the wealth of the Khan. And we see that there are musicians, we see that there are beautiful tablewares. And so what we see is refinement, elegance, sophistication, sumptuosity, and all of these things are associated with the Khan, and they are in no sense negative. The Khan is shown as presiding over a center of culture, of civilization.
And what's interesting, Mark, now that Mark knows this manuscript far better than I do because he's written about it extensively, but it was interesting because if we go back, one of the things I was thinking this was one of the first images in the book because the border is so elaborate. And you also have the coats of arms, which we usually don't associate with the middle of a manuscript. We see it at the front. And that really is an interesting point, Mark. I'm sure you've written about this and I've just forgotten that the fact that this great man, who is the greatest man in history, is shown on a page that also has the coats of arms of the patron and the kings of France.
So that's exactly right. So the patron of this manuscript was the Duke of Burgundy, a man known as John the Fearless, who himself had participated in a crusade, been taken captive by the Turks in 1396, had spent 6 months in Turkey, had eventually made his way back to France. He was one of the most ambitious and one of the wealthiest lords in Western Europe in this period. He was the one who commissioned this manuscript. He clearly identified with the Mongols, indeed with the Khans themselves. And you're absolutely right. It is very interesting to see the juxtaposition of an image of the Khan and his court with the arms of Burgundy. As a cousin, as a member of the cadet or younger branch of the royal family, he gets the royal coat of arms with a red band around it. That's what you see there. So those are the royal arms of Burgundy. And so the manuscript is also a form of mirror or of self-identification that is celebrating the Mongols.
Yeah, so interesting. And in this next image, it's all about the money, right?
Absolutely. So this is an illustration of Marco Polo's account, and it's from the passage in which Polo explains how merchants who come to the Yuan Empire, that is to say the Mongol Empire in China, must hand in their actual real goods and exchange those for paper money. This fascinated Western Europeans for centuries. Of course, they had money in Western Europe, but they had coins. And here they are illustrating this transaction. On the left, you see the Khan seated on his throne. Next to him to the right are two of his attendants or people in his administration who carry boxes of these bills, of this money, which they are about to hand over to the merchants who come in from the right, walk right to left, and hand over bags of their goods. Another thing I would point out about the three figures on the right, the three merchants, is that they appear to be from different backgrounds. And so the image may be representing the international nature of trade within the Mongol Empire, which is exactly what Marco Polo describes in his text. So again, Polo is very clear-eyed, he is very cogent, he is very objective, in many cases, if not positive about the Mongols, then neutral about them. And he gives you the facts in many cases about what it's like to live in the Mongol Empire. And this is one great example.
Yeah. And what's interesting is now we're coming to an image that is not so clear-eyed and is not so, it's sort of blending history and fallacy, and the idea of sort of this retrospective idea of putting things onto the culture. Can you talk us through this one?
Certainly. So this image illustrates a story that Marco Polo tells about when he's traveling through Persia, he comes to the city of Sava. And in Sava, he is told that that is where the three magi, so the three kings of Christian history, are buried. And he says, so they're not in Cologne, they're here. I've seen them there in Persia. And he goes on to recount the story of how the magi, when returning from adoring the Christ child in Bethlehem, they acquire a sacred fire that falls from the sky. They take it back to their temple in Persia, and then they worship it. So this image is an extraordinary example of what we call syncretism. Syncretism is the fusing of different cultural or religious traditions into a new tradition, into a new story. Here we have the three Christian kings portrayed as they are traditionally portrayed, representing the three ages of man, a youth, a middle-aged man, and an old-aged man. But instead of worshiping the virgin and child, they are worshiping fire. This, as far as I know, is the only such depiction of the Magi. So it's remarkable because what this image shows is a Parisian artist of around 1410 who was responding to Marco Polo's text by illustrating a new version of the Magi story. So one thing that I think we wanted people to appreciate is also the extent to which exposure to these stories about travel and about wonders and marvels could change Europeans' perceptions of their own traditions. And so on the right, we are showing you an image, a traditional image of the adoration of the Magi. You see the elderly, middle-aged, and youthful kings, but here they are adoring the Virgin and Child. So it's as if fire had replaced the Virgin and Child. That's fairly astonishing in the European visual tradition, and I think it merits discussion.
Yeah, and when we move to this slide, we see something that maybe people wouldn't expect, which is a unicorn at the center of this image. Now we see a camel, which we saw before, lions, swans, bears, foxes, I guess, wild boar over here. But at the center of the image is a unicorn. And what's fascinating is there was a legend in the Middle Ages that the only way to capture a unicorn, and you wanted its horn because the horn had magical properties, healing properties. The only way to capture it was to put it in a forest by itself with a virgin, and a virgin would attract the unicorn, and the unicorn would come and lay its head on her lap, and then hunters would jump out from behind the trees and be able to kill the unicorn. And this was something that was really in Marco Polo's head, like something he knew to be true. And so when he gets to India, he talks about, like, I did see a unicorn. And he says in his account that it's not quite what he expected. It's not white and pretty. It's kind of lumpy and ferocious and big and dark. And in fact, what we think he was seeing was a Sumatran rhinoceros. And a rhinoceros has one horn, unicorn, the Latin. So by definition, it is a unicorn. But what's interesting to me is that he was trying to map what he knew to be true onto what he was seeing with his own eyes. And then he describes it actually as being this sort of big, lumpy, dark, kind of ferocious thing, which matches what we know a rhinoceros to look like. But the medieval artist has then again represented it as the white unicorn of legend. So I think it's really fascinating to think about what the medieval travel imagination was and how hard they tried to get that travel imagination to match what he was actually seeing. And I'll just give one more example of that, which is the dog-headed men. And he talks twice in his text about seeing dog-headed men. And maybe, Mark, you can take it from here.
Either seeing or hearing of. It depends on the version of the story. And it isn't clear that Polo believes that such peoples exist. In fact, it's been argued that in the original story that Polo heard, the phrase would have been dog-faced people to show that these were ugly people who lived abroad, that they were different. But it's not at all clear that Polo himself believed that such things existed. But what's interesting is that in the text, as it gets transmitted in Western Europe, these do indeed become dog-headed people, which were a standard kind of foreign, marvelous people going back to antiquity, the cynocephali in Greek, the literally dog-headed people. And indeed, in this manuscript, where they are so attentive to rendering realistic detail in many of these travel texts, nonetheless, in many cases, as with the unicorn here as well, they fall back on their traditional artistic repertory and they depict typical cynocephali. Although, as you see, what's interesting about both images is that they are clothed and they are civilized. They are engaged in either labor on the right or in trade on the left. And indeed, on the island of the dog-headed or dog-faced people, they're said to be great merchants. So this is a way in which we have both a traditional motif coming back into the manuscript, but then it is modernized in its way, or it is humanized. So it's again this kind of hybrid fusion of tradition and new knowledge.
And we're going to see that when we go to our last person, who's Christopher Columbus, but I'm just going to mention this slide really quickly. This is the Book of Marvels of the World, China. And you can see China, they actually talk about vast deserts, which we think are probably the Gobi Desert, but it's inhabited by dragons. It talks about the silk trade, about how silk grows on trees, and how traders from Europe come and exchange goods in China. And these are things that that Marco Polo would very much had at the top of his mind. And then when we move to Christopher, who is well known to all of us here in America, and we were talking again about this idea of, or Mark was talking about this idea of sort of the travel imaginary and what people thought was out there. This is actually the first map that we know of that exists today, made after Christopher Columbus made his journey. So this is from 1516, I think. And just to give people an idea of what we're looking at here, this is the edge of South America. And you can see here's all the actual places that it corresponds to. This is the Atlantic Ocean. And then over here, we see the edge of the Eurasian continent. But what's fascinating is we're going to talk about this area right here. And if I spin it around again and make it a little bit bigger, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, you can see that they're represented dog-headed men. And what's fascinating is Christopher Columbus took a copy of Marco Polo's travels with him when he made his voyage. And when he came back, he said specifically, he did not see dog-headed men, but it was so strong that they appear anyway.
Absolutely right. And something you and I have talked about before is that, so once Europeans become familiar with certain lands, and as traditions fall away associating marvels with certain parts of Asia or Africa, those marvels are then moved to new lands, new territories. So in this case, we have the cynocephali who are displaced, as it were, from the Far East into this new West, into this land over the sea. And the Americas will, for many, many decades, and indeed arguably centuries, for Europeans, be a site of the marvelous, of wonders. And many of those wonders will be either directly taken from the tradition about Asia, or they will be misconstruals of information about the Americas.
And we see that in this sort of print from 1525 that represents what was happening in the Caribbean. And here we see, again, this is probably a llama. So again, something that was probably really in South America at least, but then dog-headed men chopping up people. Again, this othering that we were talking about, making them see very ferocious, very scary, very animal-like, as opposed to the civilized Europeans who are the ones getting cut up here. And then lastly, this is an image that Mark suggested about Columbus in Hispaniola.
I like this image because the artist who produced this, Theodore de Bry, had read a lot of travel accounts and he illustrated many of them. And he has given us a very nuanced and detailed vision of the Columbus text and his account of his travels. That is to say, in the background, you can see that there are figures running away. So we see the fear of the natives. But in the foreground, we see natives coming forth, barely clad, almost naked, with a great deal of riches. So this profusion of wealth, this abundance of wealth, which is promising Europeans all of the wealth to come. On the left in the foreground, we have Christopher Columbus standing in a very confident, almost arrogant pose, armed, of course, accompanied by two armed men, and facing down these people, clearly expecting their wealth, expecting their respect. To the left of that, in the middle ground, we see people erecting a cross. So we see exactly what is at stake in this image: conversion, exploitation, colonization, enslavement. And I would simply point out as well, we have these very large boats, and notice that there are three, as in the account, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. But these boats are waiting to be filled. These boats are like bank accounts or stomachs. They are waiting to be filled by all of the goods, the riches of the New World. And then also look at on the right, the background is this open vista of all of this land, and we don't see cities, we don't see people, we simply see virgin territory that is waiting to be claimed by, in this case, Spain. So I think that it's an image that, even though it comes more than a century after Columbus's first visit, it is redolent with all of the associations and myths that are driving European exploration, conquest, and colonization in this period.
Mark, we had a couple more slides, but I see that it's 12:45, so I think we should open it up for questions. And I think we both realize that some of you may not be able to stay much longer, but we're delighted to have had you. So if you need to go off and finish your lunch or walk back to work or whatever you're doing with your afternoon, please feel free. We're so excited to have had the chance to speak with you today. But for those of you who want to stay, if there are questions, we would love to hear them. Let's see what we've got. Maybe we just did such a great job that there's no questions, Mark.
Wouldn't that be satisfying?
Oh, you know what? I'm a little unsure. Okay. Okay, we have one. What about the allegations that Marco Polo never really reached China? I'm going to let you handle that one, Mark.
Sure, thank you. There's actually a book published with the title Marco Polo Did Not Go to China. And it was by a British historian back in the 90s. And the argument was that because certain things aren't mentioned, like the Great Wall, like foot binding, and because Polo could easily have gotten his information from Persian or Arabic sources, that there's no way that he did this. And so this is a modern updating of the kinds of skepticism that Polo's text was met with for centuries. However, just a few years ago, another book was written called Marco Polo Did Go to China, which basically is a point-by-point rebuttal of all of the arguments that have ever been made against Polo's going. There's no question that Polo went. And we know that because, as I said, first of all, the new toponyms. Where did he get all these new place names? He gives them in their Sino-Persian forms in many cases. That's to say, a combination of Chinese and Persian. So he's not just recycling Arabic or Persian names. So that is clue number one. Clue number two is the detail with which he talks about the Mongol government. And in particular, he mentions most of the important infrastructure that is overseen by the various departments of the Mongol Chinese government. So what do I mean by this? Censuses, grain storage, canals, roads, post stations, planting of trees, storage for famine, storage of food for famine, et cetera, et cetera. So if you map Polo's text onto the Mongol idea of their empire in China and onto the administrative infrastructure of that government, it's 1-to-1. It's perfect. So I see no reason to doubt it. And reading Marco Polo Did Go to China, I don't see how anybody can doubt anymore that he was indeed there. Part of the problem here, of course, and it goes back to how we opened this discussion, are the modern prejudices we have against the Middle Ages. Imagining that they stayed home, that they were superstitious, that they didn't know out the world, that they weren't open to new knowledge, they didn't innovate. All of this is completely false. And Marco Polo is a perfect example. Marco Polo, in fact, proves that a knowledgeable European could go abroad and go native. Marco Polo's text is written from the perspective of the Mongols. He basically becomes a Venetian-Mongol hybrid. And that's what makes his text fascinating and worth reading.
We have another question here, Mark. Are there any records of Asian explorers reaching Europe during medieval times or earlier?
Absolutely. So in my own research, I am most familiar with the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries. So there were envoys, ambassadors, who were sent from Central Asia and from as far abroad as China to Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. We have one account, for example, of a man sent by the Great Khan from Mongolia in the 1280s. Rabban Salma was his name. He was an Nestorian cleric, a kind of Eastern Christian, an Asian Christian. And he went to Italy, to France, and to England. And he toured the churches of Saint-Denis, north of Paris, and he visited the Sainte-Chapelle in the company of Philip IV, King of France. So that's just one of the more spectacular examples, and we know about it because he wrote an account of that trip, and thankfully we have that. But there are traces in diplomatic records and in chronicles of other people who came from Central Asia and from further afield to visit Europe in the Middle Ages. And certainly there must have been many people who left no trace whatsoever. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that many of the Asians and Africans who were in Europe in the Middle Ages were slaves. And there's been a wonderful book written actually by a colleague of mine at Arizona State, Hannah Barker. The title of the book is That Most Precious Merchandise, about the slave trade through the Black Sea. There were a great many slaves who are recorded in registers, especially from Venice and Genoa, also in Egypt, because the Mamluks who ran the Egyptian government in this period, the 13th and 14th centuries, kept very detailed slave registers. So for those of you who've come to this talk, again, imagining that Europe was largely cut off from the wider world, that they didn't know about, say, foreign religions, languages, what have you, all of that is completely false. And Beth and I could spend much more time talking about things like slavery, like Europeans learning foreign languages, like Persian, Arabic, and like Franciscans who are established in Beijing in the early 1300s. All of this was happening, and it's part of what we call the global Middle Ages and needs to be discussed much more as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things, Mark, to that our visitors may not think about is the way that people in the East were considering Europe, because I have a vague memory that when Genghis Khan was coming to sort of like the Austria, he was getting kind of towards Western Europe, Hungary, whatever it was over there, that he sort of turned back. And when people asked why, didn't he say something like, oh, it's just a bunch of savages, it's not worth conquering or something? Like, I think there's this idea that, you know, the West represents civilization and that we don't think about the way that Europe might have been viewed by people in the East.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things that's happening now, I think, in medieval studies, and it's really, I think, illustrated by the exhibit that you have right now around the Book of Marvels, is to consider this issue. I'll just give one great example of this. In ancient China, a text is composed called the Classic of Mountains and Seas. That text locates many marvelous creatures and phenomena, not unlike those that the Europeans have, monstrous peoples, strange natural phenomena. But whereas the Europeans locate those things in Asia and the East, the Chinese locate all of those things in the West. So there is an exact parallel in the Chinese tradition, and the Arabic tradition, the Persian tradition. So that's exactly right. This dialogue and this othering is something that is, I think, universal.
Yeah. We have a lot of great questions. I finally figured out how to open the questions. So thank you all for your questions. One of the most common ones we have is to see the last two slides. So I'm going to show those really quick. This is one that is a wonderful sort of double displacement, in that this is very much like the image that Mark talked about with Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World, the sort of naked savages greeting him there, the idea of religion and money and everything in the background. But what's fascinating is this is a illumination made around 1900, supposedly of from a medieval book. So it's a forgery, but they were already catering to what they thought people in Europe would want to think of Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World. And one thing I'll just point out about it is that in the corners, we have fruits and birds, and these are the kinds of goods that were brought back from the New World. But over here on the side with the naked savages, we have a representation of a monkey. So these sort of stereotypes that we think of in terms of making people into animals and whatnot, are still prevalent in 1900 and of course right up to today. And then the last slide we want to show is this wonderful image from the New York manuscript of the Morgan Library, talking about the sort of distinction between Europe, which you see here on the left, and Africa, which you see here on the right. And you can see that they, it's sort of this confrontational poses. You can see that the artist has made the architecture match what they thought of these two different places. And one of the fascinating things about the Book of Marvels at the Morgan is this is one of the only illuminations in the whole book that actually shows people distinguished by their skin color. And it's in the image that accompanies the entry for Europe. And when you look at the images for Ethiopia or other places, those peoples do not have darkened skin. So it's really only in this confrontational moment that they are shown in that way, which I think is very revealing.
Nothing to add. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So there are so many good questions. I'm really sorry we don't have time to answer them all because we're already way over time. But I will just take a couple of more questions based on the exhibition. Someone asked if there are other Getty manuscripts in the exhibition. There are. Please come see them. You'll see more dog-headed people, for instance, and more unicorns. So that exhibition is up until the 25th of August. And then please do not think it's over because the exhibition, a different exhibition will be on presentation in New York at the Morgan Library starting on January 24th, and the Getty manuscript will travel there. I just wanted to thank Mark, the staff of the Getty, for making this possible. Thank my co-authors on the book, everyone who made the exhibition possible at the Getty, and of course my collaborators at the Morgan Library. Mark, any last words?
That'll do it. What a wonderful exhibition. I wish I could see it. I thank you all very much at the Getty for this wonderful experience and conversation.
So thank you so much for joining us today. You'll see that on this last slide, we have a promo for an upcoming program, Frozen in Time, the Politics of 17th Century Dutch Landscapes. It's going to be fascinating, so please join us then. Thanks so much.